the program materials, but I would like to welcome our panelists. First, you can follow in the program Melissa Porter, who is Principal Legal Officer and Advisor to the Administrator for the Federal Railroad Administration. And Melissa will be our first speaker. Melissa's extensive history with FRA, as well as a Senior Transportation Counsel to the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. So Melissa has certainly seen both from the agency side and from the political side as to what goes on in the committees. And so we have a perspective, an excellent perspective from Melissa on all of the legal issues that have been associated with funding and finance, also on the safety and operations side. Our next speaker then will be Marc-Andre Roy. And Marc-Andre is Vice President North America for CPCS. And he heads the North American division for the company and has been extensively involved in funding and financing of multiple types of projects of both public and private sector. Marc-Andre just finished the first NCHRP report on alternative funding and financing mechanisms for rail projects. We know that this program got funded for 1 year by TRB and by Congress, and hopefully this will be the first of many reports that will be a multi-year program. In addition, our speaker after Marc-Andre will be Jody Miziak, and Jody is a wonderful friend of public transportation, wearing various hats. Jody is now the development director for Paddock, and Paddock is, as she will tell us, a new federal program that will be providing advisory service to agencies pursuing funding. And Jody's experience includes both work on the public agency side, working as the P3 head for Maryland DOT, and getting the purple line up and ready to go out. Still waiting for it to go out. And as well as experience with UBS and experience on the consulting side. And next will be Lori Mahan, who will be talking about the private sector perspective, I believe, although Lori could speak about many different sides of the funding and finance issue because of her extensive background, not just in banking, where she is now, let me just get this bank correct, with Lori is CIBC, and so she is looking at investments on an international basis, I believe, for CIBC's investment in financing infrastructure. But Lori has an extensive, multifaceted history and career as a banker, public sector manager, infrastructure executive, and consultant and developer. So I think we'll hear multiple perspectives from this panel on role of FRA, the role of the federal government, lots of different sources, what other services the federal government can provide in the way of Paddock, and then how does everything we have heard influence what type of funding and financing options are available? Because we heard a lot of depressing things in the prior panel. If you're an investor, are you going to come forward, and is this going to be the secure investment in which you're going to place your funds? So with that, I start with Melissa.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me here. I think for most people in this room, you know, probably the biggest news when it comes to the federal role in rail is that yesterday the House filed a conference report on the surface transportation programs, and for the first time it included a rail title as part of the overall programs. So I think that's, first of all, a very exciting thing for me, for someone who's a complete rail nerd and has been advocating for a comprehensive surface transportation program. So I'll say, well, I haven't read, first it's a massive bill, it's 1,300 pages, 200 pages of that is the rail title, so I haven't read all of the details about it. but I could talk about some of the pieces that I am aware of. But so I want to say it's a really good thing, like I said, because it's trying to solidify the programs as part of the broader surface transportation program, helps the states be able to plan comprehensively and look at all modes of transportation to try to solve the problems that they're seeing. Just want to lay out a couple statistics for you, and that's that rail ridership is up. So Amtrak ridership has increased 29% in the past decade. In the Midwest, the ridership is up between 2005 and 2014 by 66%. In the Pacific Northwest, 160,000 more people are riding the train. And on the Northeast corridor, ridership has doubled over the past 30 years. Some of you may be familiar with the Department of Transportation's Beyond Traffic report, which looked at the transportation needs and where the U.S. is going to be over the next 30 years. And what it said is that by 2045, the population is going to increase by 70 million people, which is a staggering number when you think about it. And so the big question for us is, how are all these people going to get around the United States? And knowing how the other modes of transportation, their systems are taxed at this point, we believe that rail is going to be a really big part of that solution. So I think in 2008, Congress laid a good foundation for a comprehensive rail program. That was in the Passenger Rail Investment Improvement Act, and then subsequently followed on with the billions of dollars that were provided in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. That really laid a foundation for DOT to begin the grassroots campaign for states to start thinking more about passenger rail. So since then, DOT's invested more than $10 billion in high-speed rail projects. As you saw in the last panel, and what we're going to talk about here, is that there are opportunities for private companies to be investing in rail systems, in particular in Texas and Florida, where there's active pursuit of rail projects and in fact building them. Since 2008, DOT has also, through its Northeast Corridor Future project, been trying to develop alternatives for the future of the Northeast Corridor. Again, trying to start the process for planning for where high-speed rail and rail is going to play a role in transportation on in the Northeast. Through PREA, we also started changing the relationships between the federal government and the states through Section 209 and the Section 212 process, which changed the way that states and the commuter authorities we're sharing costs for the funding of rail services. And the reason why I bring all these things up and why we laid the foundation is because all of these have helped identify the demand and the need for more funding for rail in the future. From what I've read of the new bill and from the familiarity that I have with the previous House and Senate proposals, these build on the foundation that was created by PREA, by making several different improvements. The first, which is driving performance improvements at Amtrak. Second is encouraging states to participate in the planning and funding process for rail projects. And then there are also new programs to address the state of good repair backlog. One of the things that FRA has been advocating for is, and one of the big things that I see that's missing in this bill though, is a predictable, dedicated source of funding for rail. Because for it really to get off the ground and for us, for states, for other entities to be really getting behind a long-term plan for high-speed rail, you need to know that the money's going to flow and that it's going to be available to support the programs and the projects that you're trying to build. And that's one of the things that the Department of Transportation had proposed in its Grow America Act, which again, Congress didn't pick up, but I do think that this new bill and having rail as part of the overall surface transportation policy programs may be the next step in the future when more funding is available for the programs overall. The next logical step would be trying to include those rail programs as part of a particular trust fund. In the bill itself, just to highlight a few things, the bill, it's called the FAST Act, I believe. It authorizes a little over $8 million over 5 years for Amtrak. Or it's $8 billion. Both in the Senate, their proposals were 4-year proposals, but this is more significant because it's 1 year longer than that. It also authorizes $2.2 billion over 5 years for competitive rail investment programs. Again, both the Senate and House had had 4-year proposals, but now we're looking at 5. And the funding supports 3 new programs. One is the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Program, which authorizes grants for a wide range of passenger and freight rail infrastructure, safety planning, and workforce development projects. Another program is the Federal State Partnership for State of Good Repair, which authorizes grants for state of good repair projects on publicly owned or Amtrak-owned infrastructure. And then the third program is a restoration and enhancement program, which authorizes capital and operating grants to initiate, restore, or enhance intercity passenger rail service. The operating assistance on this program would be limited to 3 years per service, and those particular grants can't be renewed. So to me, this is a good sign that Congress has created these programs and that they are willing to authorize appropriations for the funding of the programs. But the reason why that phrase authorize the appropriations for these programs is key is because now it's incumbent upon the appropriators to actually provide the funding for the programs, or else they won't have particular value, and DOT will not be able to implement them. So I think that's kind of the high-level position. DOT is now looking forward to, once this law gets passed, and finding out what money the appropriators find for the programs to figure out how we can implement them and what resources we're going to be able to have to drive some of the projects forward. And as I had mentioned before, part of the good thing is that because we did have the Passenger Rail Investment Improvement Program that started getting states thinking about the planning process, starting thinking about regional planning, there's a lot of projects that are in the pipeline that would be capable of being funded if the funding comes forward from these programs. And so you're going to hear it later from Jody too, who's going to talk more about some of the DOT resources for funding and financing different high-speed rail programs. So I think I'll leave it there and turn it over to Mark.
We'll hold questions until all 4 panelists have presented, and because I think there's going to be a lot of interaction back and forth.
Since I have the floor, maybe I'll just jump in and ask a question. I haven't read the full authorization, but do you know if the National Transportation Rail Research Program, the TRB, is refunded? I mean, that's effectively the program that funded the research that we're about to present.
So I would say someone else might know, yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
It was explicit about TCRP, but I haven't seen anything explicit about the CRP.
Well, perhaps in this opportunity. So I'm going to go over the summary of the first report of the National Cooperative Rail Research Program, which is one of the TRB's programs. It was funded once. It sounds like that hasn't been renewed. So to the extent that there's value in this research program, I think articulating that is pretty important, because making decisions on the basis of informed research is clearly something that we should all be striving for. I'll give you the quick background for why the research, and then I'll jump into to the discussion of the research itself. Passenger rail, it's no surprise to anybody in the room, generally needs public funding support. That's as much the case in the United States as it is in most other jurisdictions, including in Canada, where I'm from. And so as part of the research, we looked at the funding gap for all sorts of different types of passenger rail operations, including in this case, intercity passenger rail. We talked a lot about the California High-Speed Rail Project. I've heard all sorts of numbers. The one that keeps jumping out at me is this increasing cost projection for the project. I heard over $75 billion. Whether that's accurate or not is another question. The reality, though, is that there's a major hole in the funding plan for that project. So how's that going to get paid for? How's that going to get funded? And it's the same with commuter rail. And the project itself, the research we undertook, really looked at all types of passenger rail, with the exception of metro type systems. But in the commuter context, every single commuter rail operation in the U.S. Does not meet its cost through revenues. The cost recovery rate is in the range of 5 to 65%, based on the 24 systems that we looked at, which I think is a pretty comprehensive list. So not one of them is anywhere near 100%. So this is the research question. How do you pay for these rail projects that have a funding gap, that can't pay for themselves on the basis of the revenues that they generate? So the idea of the research was, what alternative, innovative, new models might we be able to look at in any number of jurisdictions that we might be able to bring to bear to help pay for this funding gap? That effectively was the objective of the research and the focus of the summary of this presentation. First question, that's the first of the reports, the cover of that first report. Really, it's intended to be a toolbox of funding and financing mechanisms. Who, using a show of hands in this room, has seen this report? Small hands. Who's actually read it? Okay, so it's certainly a minority of those in the room, and that strikes me to be a failure of the TRB in communicating this research. The whole idea was to make available a resource publicly. It's available on the TRB's website. There's a number of hard copies circulating that could be used by any number of entities, agencies, project components that are trying to address their funding gap problem. So to the extent that I could push one message today is this resource is available. Make use of it. I think it's got a lot of good ideas. It's not to say it's going to solve all funding problems, but it may help you get some way to addressing some of the funding shortfalls in some of these projects. So very early on in the project, we were talking to people about the research they were doing and trying to understand their projects and their needs. And one of the things that really struck us is that there's a real misunderstanding about the terms funding and financing. So right from the beginning, we spent a lot of time trying to explain this distinction. Funding is not financing. They're two very different things. Funding, it refers to the sources of revenues or other income that can be used to pay for a project or service. Funding, so that includes everything from the revenue streams related to the service itself, through ridership tickets, ancillary revenues, other income streams, including government grants and subsidies. That's funding. It's very different than financing, which is basically just a number of different tools that can be used to access money pledged against long-term revenue streams or long-term funding. So things like debt, equity, capital leasing are all examples of financing. The biggest distinction is one needs to be paid back, and that's financing. So you can't finance your way out of a funding gap. That's the basic message. Private financing is not going to solve your problem if you've got a funding gap. You've got to figure out how to fill that funding gap. But there's only one solution to addressing funding gap. It's to either increase revenues in one way or another, or to reduce the costs of the project. So this graphic is one we used simply to organize the discussion in the research, given that there's all this confusion around terminology or thinking around how these things all fit together. So using those blue little arrows, you've got project capital costs, you do all your design, planning, environmental work, you build the thing. There's no revenues that result from the operations of anything yet. You're just using public money in most cases to fund the capital costs of a public transportation project. And then you're into the operation and maintenance. And then you'll generate revenues from the assets that you built, from the service that you're providing. But in most cases, you can't finance against that because, like I said, there's a funding gap. And no one's going to lend you any money to do a project if there's a funding gap. So that's where public funding comes in. So this project spent a lot of time thinking about different public funding sources, not just the idea of grants, but how grants could be funded, how subsidies could be funded through various programs based on examples that have worked in all sorts of different jurisdictions. So I'm not going to go through each and every one of these. I have pulled out some in the following slides to highlight some of the messages, but we looked at about 25 or so different funding and financing mechanisms organized in those same buckets as the graphic that I showed in the previous slide. So focusing on the revenues, the funding that results from the assets and the services themselves, so that we're with that little orange bubble. Some examples, market pricing to maximize fare box revenues. I don't think there's anything particularly innovative about that. It is done in all sorts of places. I think it could be done better in a lot of jurisdictions. Certainly the airlines seem to have done a very good job of using yield maximization approaches through technology and otherwise to really make best use of the capacity that they're providing and generate as much revenue from that capacity. Commercial property development, joint development stations. I'll talk about one example, the Union Station project here in Washington, D.C. is a classic example. Again, nothing new, but on-board or in-station retail concessions. And then you get into things that are a bit more atypical, perhaps, in a lot of public context: branding, sponsorship of stations, station naming rights. And if I can make a point about this, what struck us when we undertook this research and talking to people about all these different mechanisms, and this is just a small subset, was that when we spoke to private sector owners of operations in the UK, for example, there was really an interest in looking at all available tools and really making the justification as to whether they think they could generate sufficient revenue to cover the cost of whatever that mechanism was. When we spoke to a lot of public entities, they were very quick to discount things, including branding, sponsorship, station naming rights, for all sorts of reasons. But what struck us is that when it's a public asset, I think we're too quick to shortchange the option. It's not going to fund the project in its entirety, but it could make that $20 million, $40 million, $50 million contribution to that funding gap. And if you have access to it, why would you consider it? So why is it that the private sector thinks very differently about, yeah, let's do that if we think it's going to cost us less than generating that revenue than the public sector does? So just to give you some examples, the Union Station redevelopment is funded in part by air rights. So this is selling the rights to develop above the tracks, and then it's going to be a multi-use facility with retail, commercial, and all sorts of other things. So that can be used to generate some funding. I kind of like this model here. This is an example of a innovative thing. I don't know how much funding they generate from this, but it shows that there's a desire to try something new. So it's a Starbucks rail car on a Swiss Railways train. I don't know, who knows how much Starbucks is paying? Maybe they're doing it just for the bragging rights. Who knows? But in any case, I'm sure it's generating something for the operation. So to kind of switch the discussion now to the public funding vehicles. So these are ways of raising money that could be used to help them fund grants and subsidies. There's all sorts of tools explained in this guidebook, in the research project. Value capture mechanisms are some. Some of these are being used right now in various projects in the U.S. So it's tax increment financing, special assessment districts, development charges, station parking charges. Again, something that is being used, but there's a lot of ways of generating greater yields from that. Controversial, but road tolling and congestion charges. Some of these have the dual benefit of both increasing demand for the rail service and raising revenues that could be used to pay for the rail service. Personal vehicle related charges, sales taxes, dedicated payroll taxes for businesses in urban centers, maybe that sort of thing in Paris, for example, and carbon credits, as we discussed in the context of the California high-speed rail project. So just looking at land value uplift capture mechanisms, so this is capturing some share of the incremental value of property as a result of being in proximity to a station or a service. This is in the case of a transit project, but we found that in a lot of cases we could find about 10 to 20% of the project's capital costs in land value uplift capture. Some of this stuff is just never captured. Just the beneficiary is those property owners that live next to the station, even though they're not the ones making the investment in the service or the project. How do you capture that? London, there's another case in Stockholm, and there's a few others. Congestion charges, so there's a cordon around the city center. Anybody entering that cordon has to pay a fee. That does a number of things, of course. It discourages use of passenger cars to get into the downtown, promotes use of transit, but it also generates revenue that can be used to help pay for transit projects if it's dedicated in some way. Probably the best example that I've seen of an initiative to really raise a significant amount of funding for projects is what's being done in Virginia with the Intercity Passenger Rail Operating and Capital Fund. They basically increased, there was an incremental increase on sales tax of a very small amount, 0.3 to 0.7%, depending on I think it's the region. But the funding potential of that is significant, and it's sustained. So we talk about long-term sustained funding streams. That's one way to do it. It's not easy to do politically, but if there's political commitment to do a project, this will go a very, very long way. And I'm not going to get into financing in any great detail. Someone else on the panel is going to go to that in presumably more detail with Lorraine's presentation. But there's all sorts of different mechanisms to help raise financing for projects against the long-term revenue streams that can be generated by a project. I want to say a word about PPPs. PPPs or P3s, public-private partnerships, they're often misconstrued. And we've seen projects all over the place where there's this interest in saying, well, let's build a project as a PPP and that will solve our funding problem. PPPs are not a way to fund a project. They're a project delivery mechanism that typically have a financing component. But you're not going to find any serious private partner that's going to come to the table unless they are sure that there's going to be sufficient funding in the long term, whether that's through an availability payment, maybe through ridership itself. There's a lot of examples of that in the world, where they could basically pay back their financing and generate some kind of return on that investment. The next, I'll skip this next part of the presentation in the interest of time. It's a bit more academic. It's discussed in a lot of detail in the guidebook itself, which, like I said, is publicly available. But I will say this, and I'll use a PPP analogy. Again, I mentioned I'm based in Canada. At the federal level, there's a P3 unit. We've got a pot of funding for public-private partnerships. But one of the policies at the federal level is any infrastructure project that's making a request for federal funding in excess of $100 million, they're required to undertake a P3 screen. It's not to say they need to do a P3. It's only to say that they've looked at it, they've considered it, and either decided that it didn't make sense for whatever reason, or if there was a case to be made in terms of value for money for delivery through a P3, then they would move in that direction. What I would like to see with the guidebook is that, like I said, there's about 25 different mechanisms with great examples of where these things have worked, the enabling environment that's required to make them work, some of the barriers and things that you may want to watch out for that may include, and the funding magnitude of these various different tools. Making it almost a requirement that anybody requiring or asking for funding for a project could actually justify that they've looked at what these options are. Maybe the Swiss Starbucks train example is a bit extreme, but the idea is that there are options out there. You should at least consider all your options before you just say, we've got a gap, how do we fund it? It doesn't cost very much money to do that. You just flip through a guidebook and it's been set up in a way that's very easy to do. You just flip through the different tools, decide going, yeah, that one probably doesn't make any sense. That one, maybe let's study that in more detail, and on and on. And you may be able to find 5, 10, 20% of your project funding gap just by doing that. It's probably not going to solve the funding problem or the full extent of the gap, but it will go some way. And if there are mechanisms you could use, why wouldn't you? So that's my plug for the guidebook and its use. Like I said, it was designed for that. So I hope it will be used for that same purpose. So I'll skip through these a bit academic here. I'll just end with a discussion beyond funding and financing. The problem of funding rail projects is not altogether different than funding any public infrastructure. There's scarce public resources to pay for them and competing priorities for that scarce funding. So that's always going to be the case with high-speed rail, with highways. You name it, if it's public infrastructure. In a perfect world, one could generate funding from all future project benefits and charge full cost for use of all infrastructure, but this is not a perfect world. I think we're moving in that direction with big data and other ways of quantifying the benefits and cost of using infrastructure, but I don't think we're there yet. So the research report that we undertook, and I'll just close out with these two last slides here, was to address the question of how to fund a project that has a funding gap. I think the other interesting and probably more important question for everybody in this room is why to fund a rail project that has a funding gap. What we found is that there's a very long range of different ways of looking at the benefit cost of rail projects, which I think frustrates the process of considering these projects for funding. And I was just struck in this little newsletter that's included in our packages. There's a research project that's just being kicked off to try to develop a fairly systematic public benefits methodology. I think it's a great idea. That's exactly what's lacking now. In fact, in the UK right now for rail projects, they have a standardized methodology that they use so that projects can be compared on an apples-to-apples basis. The last point is this. All this has to tie back to long-term transportation policy. It's not just about funding rail projects. So 30 years out, what kind of future do you see for a corridor? Is it like that image on the left, one that's focus on the use of passenger cars. In fact, we're still using passenger cars in the next 30 years. Or one that's more focused on rail. And I think everybody in this room will appreciate that we are all committed to seeing rail corridors. But the issue is not just about funding projects, it's about using policy and policy objectives to discourage the use of one mode, generate revenue from that mode to help pay for the ones that you see as being a key part of that future vision. Sort of along the lines of picking winners and losers, which is a bit tricky, but that's what politicians are theoretically there to do. They're there to hold out a vision, commit to that vision, and go. Not just do this kind of horse trading thing about let's make sure that we always pander to the greatest number of winners, so that it's the most popular thing to do. So all that to say that I think there's much bigger policy issues, and I think that's where champions come from. Is buying into that and wanting to make it happen, even if it's going to cost them what they're seeing. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you, Marc-Andre. I think that you gave an excellent entree for Jody, since so much of her program is looking at assisting agencies identify their options. Jody, take it away.
Thank you, Sharon. What's next? Oh, make sure I can advance this.
Sorry. I'll have to flip the presentation back.
Let it flip in the presentation. Oh, okay. Cool. All right, thanks, Sharon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I apologize in advance. I'm just getting over a bit of a cough, so I may be reaching for a cough drop or some water partway through. This is the general introduction to Paddock, which is the Build America Transportation Investment Center. I am a recent addition to Paddock. It is a relatively young institute in DOT, and I will get into the history in a second. But it's really focused, as the previous presenters have discussed, on thinking about ways to have a more comprehensive, customer-focused approach to funding and financing and facilitating these large infrastructure projects, particularly from the federal perspective, so that they that as they progress through the processes, that at least the federal government is not the barrier. There may be other barriers in the political world or the financial world and the funding world, but really trying to help projects move forward in a way that we have effective project delivery. Melissa already mentioned the Beyond Traffic report. It really focuses on a lot of things, but it really focuses the mind on this idea that we really need to bring investment to the table for a successful future in transportation, and everything that is done at DOT really focuses on the findings and the statistics in Beyond Traffic. So I encourage everyone to take a look at it. It definitely highlights this status quo of an infrastructure backlog. We have lots of things that we need to do: high-speed rail, intercity rail, many other projects that we've all been thinking about for many years. And in some ways there are funding shortfalls. Obviously, there's a definite need for long-term funding sustainability, but we also have programs at the federal level that may not be used in an optimal way currently, and may not be pieced together in ways that can get these projects moving forward. All these projects are huge. All these projects require a tremendous amount of funding and financing coordination. And so if any one piece is a little out of step, it can mean a lot for the schedule and for delivery for a project. So we're focusing on that as we're moving Paddock ahead, knowing that there are resources and that there are resources that we need to use more effectively. So the history of Paddock, as I said, it's relatively a young organization within DOT. It was part of this broader initiative last summer across entities, across federal entities, that focused on the Build America initiative, where we do, as I said, we have all these. Is this cutting in and out badly? I don't know if it's me or it's the mic. We have all these programs that are out there. They've been funded and structured in different ways. They may not necessarily have all the same rules. They don't have all the same people running them, and they're often very confusing for a project that comes kind of cold into a project delivery approach, may not have delivered a project before, especially not on the scale of some of the projects we're talking about in this room today. So it grew out of that initiative last summer. A lot of the efforts that were going on at the DOT level over the past year was really with existing staff resources. So you had people in budget, you had people in policy, you had people in the secretary's office who were really focusing on figuring out how the different resources could be brought together in a more effective way. We could have a more customer-focused approach, and how projects could be ushered and facilitated through the process in a way that resulted in good project delivery. Since then, fortunately for those who are kind of doing this as part of their other jobs, they hired a group of dedicated staff, myself included, led by the executive director, Andrew Wright, to really focus the efforts. And as I know, when I joined Maryland in the P3 office, it was a similar story. You had a lot of good ideas, you had a lot of great people working on them, but they all had other jobs. It wasn't until we decided to, at the Maryland level and now at the federal level, to bring in dedicated staff and resources to focus on institutionalizing these efforts and making sure the connections are made, to know that every day someone is walking into the office with this as their goal, greater coordination across the different entities, because as you all know, anyone who's dealt with DOT, it's a massive organization, and it's hard to find the perfect person for you to help progress a particular issue if you're not familiar with it. So we're hoping to take some of the mystery out of that and make sure that that's not a barrier to project delivery. So as I said, Paddock was in existence for the past year, although maybe not with the full staffing, but that doesn't mean that there hasn't been progress. Those who were focusing on it, up until the point where the dedicated staff came on, were really focused on getting new and interesting projects into the TIFIA pipeline, working with RIF to figure out ways in which projects can progress through that process. Working with our existing resources in federal highways that have been focused for years on putting out guides, draft guides, some model contracts, resources with respect to value for money analysis. All of those exist throughout DOT, and this is really an effort to bring it together so there's a one-stop shop. You don't need a manual to help lead you through it. There really is a place where you can go and say, I want to do a big, complex infrastructure project. What are the tools that I can get from the federal government? How can I be helped? And where can I learn about these things if I'm not, an expert? So some of those things have been pulled together, and we continue to pull those together in a more effective way. And we have started to engage with projects. The projects I'm going to talk about today are unfortunately not in the rail context, only because I want to talk about projects that we've started to really engage with and have progress. I'm hoping that at a similar conversation next year, we'll have these types of examples for the rail context, because those are definitely within the sweet spot of what Paddock is doing. The one project that's mentioned up here is I-10, where there's been engagement trying to work through scoping, thinking about project delivery approaches as a roadway project, but a lot of the same concepts are applicable across the modes. This is sort of the general goals of Paddock. As you see, it's spelled out, Build America Transportation Center. And at the end of the day, we're trying to pull together a lot of different threads of what's going on in the federal government to make sure that there is perceived, as there isn't currently, a single point of contact when you have a big project that's coming through the pipeline. This is the general mission, and I'll get into each of the categories in greater depth. But it's expand, innovate, and deliver. Fairly easy, right? It makes it sound like it's, a project can happen in no time. Expansion is, as I mentioned, TIFIA, RIF, PABS, all these different programs that have significant capacity are not being used as extensively as they could be. People think of TIFIA for certain projects, they think of RIF in a certain context, they think of PABS for a certain delivery approach, and not necessarily thinking about how they get pieced together. So we want to make sure that that is super clear, and that, you know, for projects that may not necessarily have thought about those tools, ways in which that you can get over the line in using them. Innovate can mean a whole bunch of things, but in this particular context, we think about it in terms of taking examples of projects and approaches that have been completed on other types of assets, either within the same modal category or elsewhere, and really communicating that in a way so that people are not starting from scratch with each project. You don't want to be doing that when you're going through, you know, environmental processes, political processes, to also recreate the wheel for project delivery and a financing approach. Makes no sense. A lot of these issues have already been dealt with before. A lot of the questions have been asked before. Issues even dealing with how to apply Buy America and DVE for projects that may cross a variety of different modal categories is a major issue for us, because it comes up more frequently when you have projects that are drawing upon different aspects of the federal government's area. So this is a big component, and it's also something that we're doing in partnership with AASHTO. So we've joined with AASHTO to deliver the Paddock Institute, not to be confused with Paddock, the Paddock Institute, which is the educational arm of Paddock. And that will be, if you go to our website, there's a link to the Paddock Institute, so that we're kind of supercharging our efforts, taking a lot of the educational outreach training that has been going on for many years in a variety of different contexts, and really providing that in a more focused way for projects or states or other entities that come to us and say, we really don't know how to do this part of a project or get over the line with this particular analysis. Can you help us? And we're aiming to provide those types of resources so that projects can keep moving forward. And finally, it is deliver, which is the key to all of these projects. You can have all the information in the world, you can have all the resources in the world, but if you don't know how to piece them together and on a timely basis, so that we're all eventually going to be able to use this infrastructure within our lifetimes, it's important to make sure that everything is aligned with the TIFIA process and a RIF process and a PABS process and some grant process and environmental processes are actually all aligned, so that when you get to the end of the day, there is a financial close, there's a notice to proceed, and actual shovels going into the ground to get projects moving forward. That's what we're all in it for. We do a lot of analysis up front, but at the end of the day, we want these projects to actually happen in a way that they are reflecting the original intentions and policy intentions. And as I said, the projects that I'm going to talk about in this presentation are not rail or even transit, largely because a lot of the initial project engagement over the past 6 months or so has just been on projects that happen to have come through the pipeline as they were thinking about building up Paddock. One good example, and which does have lessons learned for those who are engaging the private sector, is Pennsylvania Bridges. As an initiative over the past year to bundle a large number of smaller bridges in Pennsylvania in a P3 to upgrade them, to rehab them, and to operate and maintain them, not operate them, over a period of time with a financing component. So it was a very complex approach. You have the private sector very attuned to the potential risks of environmental and financial timing and making sure everything happens is in a streamlined manner as possible. So one of the things that the federal government was able to do was provide exemptions for this project from standard federal highways environmental requirements, not necessarily to lift requirements, but to allow the private sector to have greater control and involvement with the environmental process, so that they can kind of program the projects in the way that makes sense for their project delivery. So just a little tweak like that can make a project more appealing to the private sector, and those types of things can be done in a variety of different modal contexts. Another example is Port Newark, again, another not rail project, but one in which you have a traditional view of TIFIA as roads, you're seeing some other projects coming in through the TIFIA loans process, but to have ports come through that process has really not been a standard, and this was a focused effort between the Paddock, the early Paddock team, and MARAD to think about how you can look at port projects in a creative way and bring this additional financing tool to the table so some of this infrastructure can happen more quickly than it would otherwise happen. Those types of thinking, that type of thinking is definitely going on for rail projects and transit projects currently to see how it can be translated more effectively. This is just in summary. There's a whole host of things we're working to pull together. Obviously, it's a very new program. We're working very closely with all the different programs and operating administrations, DOT, to make it fully streamlined and institutionalized within DOT. That is a process. We're currently working with a variety of pilot projects to make sure that the process is attuned to the needs of projects. And definitely you'll see more guidance coming out over the next few months in terms of how to engage with Paddock directly. In the meantime, if you are interested in more information, talking about a specific project, we are welcoming project sponsors to definitely come in, talk with us. We've definitely talked with people in the rail space, and continue this dialogue about what are the very specific ways in which there can be value added from Paddock, such that that a project can get done more effectively. And that is the general overview of Paddock.
Thank you, Jody. And now Lori, you will.
A lot of meat here,
Yeah, a lot
and
of
it's
meat.
almost lunchtime, so we'll just do appetizers. I want to make a couple of perhaps unrelated but absolutely essential points about private investment in infrastructure. The first of which is we already have trillions of dollars of private investment in infrastructure in the United States. If you all stop and think for a minute, airlines, railroads, trucking companies, port terminals, some roads, and everyone who holds municipal bond. So we often forget that there is already a vast amount of private investment in infrastructure in the US. And talking about how to get private investment in infrastructure is probably not the right argument. The argument really is, why are private investors who have shown us they like infrastructure not investing in our projects? So let me address that for the moment. If this is switching microphone. There's also one, so generally when we think about private investment, with the exception of the muni bond group, we think about equity, and investors put equity in projects because they are willing to go at risk, assuming that at some point in the life of their investment, they will get a return that's higher than the return they would have gotten if they bought a US Treasury bond. And that's generally a pretty simple way to think about it, right? The equity investors that you think about in infrastructure around the world, the Canadian pension funds, the Australian pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, the plethora of new equity funds that have been raised around the world from private markets. But I think it's also important to recognize that some governments have actually taken the step of acknowledging that when they make a grant to a project, it's actually governmental equity. And the reason that that's an important concept is that equity is recyclable, and equity is something that over the life of an asset, the debt equity mix, and if I get too bankerly, throw something at me, but the debt equity mix can change because as more certainty comes into a project, you can go raise more debt, and you can therefore take out some of that equity, get your return on it by converting it into debt and taking the money out and using it for something else. Jody and I worked on a project together on the same side of the table in Maryland for the Seagirt Marine Terminal, where effectively the very simple construct of that deal was that the state had invested in a marine terminal. The state wanted to monetize its investment in that. We therefore found a private company that was willing to come in and enter into a very long-term concession for that. And all of the money the state got back, because we had made that investment, was dedicated to other transportation projects in Maryland, which wouldn't have been funded otherwise. And in fact, we were even able to issue tax-exempt bonds because the state committed to use it for specific projects. That concept of recycling equity has a lot of applicability when you think about projects like rail and intercity rail and high-speed rail, where you have an asset life that may be 100 years. The difficulty of trying to fund and finance projects that have a 100-year asset life over one generation of users, which is pretty much all the rating agencies will give you credit for, is that you're never going to close that gap. You are never going to have enough revenues because you are building an asset that is designed to last this much, and you're only looking at this much of the timeline to create the revenue stream. So how do you fix that? So there are a couple of ways that have been done very successfully, one of which is a high-speed rail project. So HS1 in the UK very cleverly recognized from the very beginning that a lot of the construction risks and a lot of the early project development risks belonged with government, but that if they got the project off the ground, that they were in fact creating an asset that was a cash generator for many, many, many generations. So what did they do? The government came in, initially funded the construction and development of that, but designed that project in such a way, and this is going to be my essential point, that at the proper time, they were able to start hiving off pieces of that very complex project and matching them with available private funding, in this case equity, from a number of Canadian pension funds, who then came in, paid back the government, not all of their equity, but paid them back 30 years worth of equity. That's how long the concession is for. And the government got back, I think it was £7 billion. It's a lot of money that can then be used for something else. So when we think about development projects in the US, however, we tend to have this one megalith project mentality where we wrap everything up together and we don't pay a lot of attention to which pieces of that can generate revenues when, which pieces can be recycled from a grant into something else and have that money recycled into either an extension of that project or into something completely different. And if you think about defining projects properly, it even extends to the point that we define transportation projects as transportation projects, thereby not capturing all the other values that get created by those projects. So if you look to Hong Kong as probably the world's most perfect example of doing it right, where effectively the MTR owns and controls all of the real estate that is part of its system. And because of that, they generate a profit and cover all their capital costs. So the new high-speed rail line that MTR is building to Shenzhen, where they're going to link with the high-speed rail line that government of China is building into Shenzhen, that is going to be completely self-funded because of the tremendous real estate play that is available on that corridor. And they're building massive parking lots and shopping centers and all of that to create this border point, which is that the revenue projections are astronomical. So I think we have to do a better job, and I'm a transportation planner so I can say this, of planning our projects so that we are not just drawing skinny little lines on a map. Because no matter what you do, that skinny little line on a map is not going to generate sufficient revenue in the right period of time to allow you to build what you want to build. So I think a couple of things to keep in mind when we think about trying to bring real equity into projects are that equity investors need a return, and they're willing to wait a little bit for it, but they won't wait forever. So designing projects where the first dollar of revenue doesn't come in for 12 years or 15 years doesn't fly. Literally, there's no equity investor that I've seen yet that's going to wait that long for a return. 5 years maybe, construction period, no revenues, okay. Couple years of ramp up, but designing projects, so when we look at something like the Gateway project in New York, and I'm sorry Stephen isn't here yet, but when you look at that project, in some ways that is a perfect project for private investment, except that it's not being thought of properly, because the fact that you kind of have to build the new tunnels and then fix the old ones before you get any additional revenue due to additional capacity means you're waiting a very, very long time. for that new revenue. I think that the last point that I really want to emphasize, and again, I think it's the value of the private sector in many, many ways, is that reducing projects' costs is as good as finding new money. And I think we sometimes forget about that. One of the wonderful things that the federal credit programs do is reduce the overall weighted average cost of capital by being able to use a credit guarantee to buy down the debt rate. But there are other ways to reduce the cost of projects, and the feds give us on one hand and take away on the other, right? The massive amount of federal over-design of things like rail cars and things like that create a real issue in the global marketplace, because I'm looking at my friends here from Japan because I think they know this issue very well, that the US spec high-speed rail cars are frankly not considered useful anywhere else in the world because they're so expensive and they're so over-designed.
And how the various opportunities work together. We heard in the panel this morning about the uncertainty associated with a lot of these projects, that incrementalism in implementation, not knowing what the political certainty is going to be. Governor Brown might be out of office, and who knows what's going to happen with change in the legislature and restructuring of the program. So I'm sure that you're all hurrying to protect the monies from the cap and trade program so that they can be bonded against as quickly as possible and secured. How does all of this feed into this picture of certainty, ability to deliver funds, and ability to deliver financing?
I'll take it first and then maybe Morgan wants to talk. In general, most investors will not take what they call development risk, but they will take construction risk. So what does that mean? Environmental permitting risk is not typically something you can pass on to private equity because it's all dollars at risk. Citing land acquisition, all those kinds of things that are kind of, yes or no. You either get it or you don't, and if you don't, you're dead. Those are typically not risks private equity will take. Now, having said that, that's actually starting to change, and it may be changing for the better for certain kinds of projects. Probably not for $75 billion projects, but maybe for $5 billion ones. There is so much capital chasing long-term investments in good infrastructure that a number of the major pension funds, particularly CPPIB, which is one of the big Canadian funds, and Ontario Teachers, have both recently announced that and Cassie Depot, have all recently announced that they are willing to make investments in certain types of greenfield projects, and they're willing to co-underwrite development risk with a governmental partner. So to that end, Cassie Depot, which is the pension fund of the province of Quebec, has actually entered into a very interesting partnership with the province itself, that it will develop with Quebec a number of rail projects in the province. Fascinating. They're doing that to guarantee themselves a pipeline of projects to the president. I think we're going to see more of that, and I think that will be a true public-private partnership because it really will start early enough on that they will start taking some development risk. But as I say, I think those are going to be bite-sized enough projects that if they spend $50 million on development, it's going to be a rounding error in their overall return.
So this is co-development. If we have to give it a name, it's co-development.
Co-development.
If I could just add, equity looks to the certainty of the future cash flow to a lot of it in a major way. And that's what they use to go and finance a lot of the upfront costs they might take on. I don't know in the US whether there's something akin to a long-term sustainable funding model that lends itself well to things like availability payments, which is a very common model in a lot of jurisdictions where government says, look, we appreciate that demand is uncertain. We want to remain in control of pricing for tickets. We'll tie it into our broader transportation policy. So we will pay an operator X per year over the next 30 years. And whether there's one rider or a million on this service, we will pay you that same amount. All we're doing is we're expecting you to deliver the service at a certain level of quality and service And if you can demonstrate you've done that, you will get your money. So for an equity perspective, it's easy to say, well, look, we think we can deliver that, so we don't need to worry about the demand risk. We've got a lot of certainty about that cash flows, provided that you've got confidence in that government, and you go to the bank with that. I think just thinking about the mechanism for something akin to an availability payment, which requires a long-term dedicated funding stream, is one way to create that certainty in the private sector for some of these long-term fee-free projects.